This is the story of Air Canada Flight 624. It's been a while since I've done a video on Air Canada, the last one being Air Canada Flight 143 or the Gimli glider. But today's incident is far less known, and I thought it would be nice to shed some light on the story behind Flight 624. On the 29th of March 2015, an Airbus A320 was to fly from Toronto to Halifax with 133 passengers on board and 5 crew members. Before the flight even took off, dispatch was busy disseminating weather data to the crew. The weather at Halifax was not that good. Winds were at 15 knots and gusting to 21 knots, and visibility was at 2,600 feet with heavy snow. At 10:05 p.m. on the 28th of March 2015, the plane took off. En route, the pilots talked about alternate airports just in case the weather at Halifax did not allow them to land. Their planned alternate at this time was the Greater Moncton International Airport. While en cruise, the pilots calculated the important metrics for their landing at Halifax. They determined that their final approach fix was to be 2,200 feet above sea level. Their final approach fix is a point in 3D space. To make a safe landing, the plane must be at a particular speed at a particular altitude at the final approach fix. Their minimum descent altitude was at 813 feet above sea level. They also had to approach the runway at an angle of 3.5 degrees, a bit steeper than usual, but nothing the A320 was not designed for. At 10:56 p.m., the information from dispatch was not encouraging. An Air Canada plane had just landed on runway 05, and they had to do a missed approach at first. If the weather got any worse, they'd have to divert. The pilots went over the go-around procedures, and they also looked at the winds and the runway conditions. They made sure that it was safe to land the plane. At 11:11 p.m., the weather was not cooperating. Visibility had dropped down at 1,320 feet, and it was snowing heavily. According to rules, they could not proceed past the final approach point if the visibility was lower than 2,600 feet. The crew decided that if the weather were to be bad when they reached Halifax, they'd hold until they hit the minimum fuel needed to divert. As the plane descended down to 29,000 feet, the pilots talked about the non-precision approach onto runway 05. As they flew towards Halifax, they asked the terminal controller for permission to hold at SETI. SETI was a point on the Fundy 8 standard terminal arrival route. The crew could hold till 1 a.m. at SETI with the fuel that they had. At 11:34 p.m., as the plane entered a hold at SETI, the weather was not improving. As snowplows removed copious amounts of snow from the runway, the visibility was still at 1,300 feet, too low for a landing. At 12:07 a.m., Flight 624 was still in the hold. The captain said that if the weather did not improve in the next 20 minutes, they'd divert to Moncton International Airport. At 12:09 p.m., the controller comes on and lets the crew know that the visibility has dropped to 650 feet. That's not what the crew wanted to hear. But 4 minutes later, the controller lets the crew know that the controller had made a mistake. The visibility was at 1,300 feet and improving. Soon it was at 2,600 feet, and the vertical visibility was at 300 feet. With the weather now at the required minimum, the crew started to prepare for the approach. At 12:16 a.m., the controller cleared the flight to Oscar Delta Kilo Alpha Sierra, the intermediate fix, and it was allowed to descend to 4,000 feet. From Oscar Delta Kilo Alpha Sierra, they could make a straight-in approach to runway 05. At 12:23 a.m., the plane was 12 nautical miles from the runway, and it was level at 3,400 feet, and the crew began to configure the plane for a landing. 11 nautical miles from the runway, the crew started a left turn to intercept the localizer. 12:26 a.m., with just 8 nautical miles to go, the captain ordered the landing gears to be lowered, but the landing lights on the plane were off. The tower controller ordered the snowplows to vacate the runway. Soon the flaps were set to 3 and they were configured for landing. As the plane continued to fly towards the final approach fix, the first officer started to count down the distance. When they were right at the FAF, the pilot flying set the flight path angle knob to minus 3.5 degrees, telling the plane to descend at a constant 3.5 degrees. At 12:29 and 27 seconds, the radio altimeter called out 400. With them being 1.2 nautical miles from the runway, they were now at the minimum descent altitude. The captain says, minimum, lights only. With the plane at 0.7 nautical miles from the runway, both pilots agreed that they could see approach lights. Right as the plane reached 100 feet, the landing lights were switched on. The autopilot was disconnected, and the first officer asked the captain to pull up. The plane flew through power cables, plunging the airport into darkness. 1 second before impact, the captain sets the engines to max power in an attempted go-around. But it was too little, too late. The left landing gear made contact with the approach lights. The plane skidded along the snow-covered ground, and it proceeded to strike the localizer antenna. The plane was still carrying quite a bit of kinetic energy, and due to the ground sloping up, the plane was airborne again. But not for long. The plane touched down 2 more times, and it slid along the runway. The plane finally came to rest 1,900 feet from the runway threshold. The controller sounded the alarm. Flight 624, for some unknown reason, had fallen short of the runway, but thankfully all 138 people on board survived. One of the first things that the investigators had to check was the weather. Was it even safe to carry out an approach with the weather being so bad? According to Air Canada, a pilot can continue the landing if he or she has a visual on one of 10 visual references. These references include things like approach lights, the runway threshold lights, and other runway features like that. From the CBR, the investigators heard that the pilots did have a visual as they got closer to the runway. The flight path angle that they were flying was of particular interest to the investigators. The whole idea of the flight path angle approach is to descend at a fixed angle from a predetermined point so that the plane will cross the threshold of the runway at a predetermined altitude. The pilot could verify the flight path of the plane by making use of a table provided. The table had altitudes that they should be at for specific distances from the runway, but according to Air Canada's standard operating procedures, the pilots did not have to monitor the flight path after they engaged the FPA mode. Contrary to that, Air Canada's and Airbus's flight crew operations manuals said that the pilots had to monitor the flight path even after they had engaged the FPA mode. On Flight 624, the pilots did not monitor the flight path after they had engaged the FPA mode. This was the first clue to the crash. Looking back at the flight path, they see that the crew had started their 3.5-degree descent 0.2 nautical miles from the final approach fix. This meant that for the remainder of the flight, they were below their published approach. What this meant was that when they did reach the minimum descent altitude, Flight 624 was further away from the runway than they thought. So as they began to descend, they did not know that they had started their descent too soon. Making matters worse, it was quite windy. The winds were pushing the plane further away from the correct descent profile. Since the pilots were not monitoring their descent, they were unaware of the fact that they were being pushed around by the chilly wind. Runway 05 was equipped with PAPI lights, and therefore they should have seen that they were well below their intended glide slope. But the snow on the night of the accident would have made it hard for the pilots to see the lights of the runway. Making matters worse, the runway lights were at level 4 in terms of brightness when they could go to a level 5, meaning that the lights were not as bright as they could be. The snow might have caused them to lose sight of the runway lights momentarily. We cannot be certain of exactly what the crew saw, but analysis shows that on approach, at least a few lights of the runway were visible to the crew. They also would have been able to see a few edge lights and a few omnidirectional lights despite the snow. While not all lights on the runway, it should have given them an idea as to where the runway was. The report also does talk about how hard it is to judge vertical position even on a clear night. But the question still remains, why didn't the crew attempt to go around? The crew probably got glimpses of the runway as they were making this approach, and this made them think that they'd have a visual on the runway by the time they were at the MDA. Remember, seeing at least one of the 10 designated lights was enough for them to continue the approach, so they went ahead. In a normal approach, as they got closer, the lights that they saw earlier would get brighter, and it would be easier for the pilots to maintain visual contact with the runway lights. But since they were further away from the runway than usual, this was not the case. The lights were quite dim, but not invisible. Moving on. Flight crews are subject to something called continuation bias. What this means is that without something major happening, the pilots will stick to their decision to continue the landing. In the case of Air Canada Flight 624, the pilots had seen a few lights of the runway and they decided to continue the approach. But they were slowly drifting away from their intended flight path. It wasn't sudden, it was imperceptible. The winds were pushing them away so slowly. There wasn't a drastic change that made the pilots go, "Wait, what was that? Maybe we should go around." And because of that, they did not change their decision to continue the landing. But that's not the whole story. Experienced pilots can just look at a runway and figure out if they're too high or too low. For example, if you're too high, the runway looks kind of rectangular. The lower you get, the more the runway looks like an isosceles trapezoid. In technical terms, your elevation above the runway can determine the aspect ratio between the runway edge lights and the threshold lights, and pilots can pick up on this. In the case of Flight 624, they would have only seen this when they were really close to the runway, and due to the snow, they might not have seen the entire runway at once. So with limited visual cues, a short time to react, reduced runway light settings, winds that were pushing them off course, and the early descent, the accident was all but certain. Like with most accidents, a long list of things had to go wrong for this accident to happen, but the industry has learned from its mistake. Air Canada Flight 624 is a perfect example of how things can go wrong when nothing seems to be awry on the surface. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. A big thank you to iTrapper for letting me use his amazing footage on my videos. If you want to watch more videos like this, do consider checking out the playlist on screen right now. Thank you. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe.